Hello children, it's Grandma Carla back with more of a very neat book. I am loving Emily's imagination, a runaway imagination, because I kind of have a runaway imagination too. Even now, Grandma Carla has a little bit of a runaway imagination. So, this is like a little Grandma Carla story. I see myself in this little girl. Okay, so here we are with chapter 7, and Emily and the light flaky pie crust. Emily loved to watch Grandma measure out dress material on the dry goods side of the store. Times were hard that year, and the ladies who bought dress goods did not want to buy 1 inch more than they needed. Grandma would take the dress pattern and lay it out on the material before she cut the goods from the bolt. All of the ladies in the store would gather around and watch while Grandma figured and figured how to save material. Emily leaned against the counter and watched. She listened too, and she learned all sorts of interesting things. She learned, for example, that Arlene Twitchell never ate the crust of her sandwiches. That was bad enough, but the shameful part was that her mother did not expect her to eat the crust. She trimmed the crust off Arlene's sandwiches herself. The way she spoiled that girl, and the way the boys admired Arlene. Well, Emily did not see why anyone should expect Arlene to eat crust of her sandwiches. Arlene not only had curly hair, she was the prettiest girl in town. Who was Liberty holding aloft a cardboard torch in the 4th of July parade? Arlene, of course. And who was crowned Queen of the May in front of the whole school? Arlene. Who else? It was girls like Emily who had to eat the crust of the sandwiches as well as carrots and burnt toast in the hope that their hair might curl. Emily learned lots of other things while Grandma laid out patterns on goods. She learned that Grandma Russell, a lady so old the whole town called her Grandma, had climbed up on her roof and mended the shingles herself, and she was 82 if she was a day. It just showed what a little pioneer blood in the veins could do for a person. Once Emily ducked under the counter because Fong Quack came into the store, and while she sat there among the paper bags, she heard one of the ladies telling someone that the secret of the lightest, flakiest pie crust you ever saw was adding a generous pinch of baking powder to the dough. Emily picked up her ears at this bit of information. A generous pinch of baking powder added to the dough made a light, flaky pie crust. She must remember to tell Mama. When Mama baked the pie, she always apologized. "I don't know what the trouble is, but my pie crust isn't as light as it should be." Daddy always answered, "It tastes good to me." Emily did not like pie crust, so she usually ate the filling and left the crust. No one ever said eating pie crust made hair curly. Emily forgot about the cooking secret that she had in her possession until one Sunday morning at breakfast, when Mama suddenly exclaimed, "My land! This is the day of the potluck dinner at the church. I've been so busy it completely slipped my mind." "What are we going to take?" asked Emily. Mama dropped into a chair to think a minute. She was dog-tired from all of the work that summer. Finally, she said, "Emily, I'm afraid we can't stay for the dinner after the church service. There isn't time to kill and fry some chickens, and there isn't a thing in the house I can take." "Miss the potluck dinner at the church?" Emily was dreadfully disappointed. That meant that she would have to go to Sunday school and then come home while all of the other boys and girls stayed for church and the dinner. "Isn't there anything we can take?" she pleaded. "Remember, Mama, you said that you would remind the minister to say something about more donations for the library." Daddy, who had eaten a big bowl of oatmeal with thick cream and a plate of bacon and eggs and fried potatoes, said, "We always have plenty of milk and eggs. What about custard pies?" "I don't have time to make pies before church," answered Mama. Emily could not bear missing the potluck dinner, especially when the library might be announced from the pulpit. "Mama, could I make custard pies?" she asked. "If I skipped Sunday school and went to church instead, there would be time." "Please, Mama?" Mama smiled at Emily. Perhaps you could. At least you could help me. Come on, let's get to work. While Mama cleared the kitchen table, Emily got out the breadboard, the rolling pin, and the pie pans. Daddy put another stick of wood into the fire so that the fire would not die down. Emily took a big bowl from the pantry shelf. Tell me what to put in, she called to Mama in the kitchen. 2½ cups of flour, directed Mama. Some salt, not quite a teaspoon. Let's see, some lard. You'd better let me measure that. Mama came into the pantry and deftly measured the lard out of the lard bucket. Now, Emily, take 2 knives and slash through the flour and lard until it is as fine as cornmeal. Emily started to slash. She was about to mention her secret for the light, fluffy pie crust, but then she decided no, she would surprise Mama. She would surprise the whole congregation with her pie crust. People who chose her pie for dessert would take one bite and say, "What light, flaky pie crust! I wonder who baked it." Then Emily would smile modestly, and Mama would say Emily baked it. And all the ladies would ask her for the secret of her light, flaky crust. Quickly, Emily added a generous pinch of baking powder and then, not certain how big a generous pinch should be, added another generous pinch to make sure. Then she slashed and according to Mama's directions, added water, just a little bit. There are 2 secrets to making good pie crust, said Mama. Use very little water and handle the dough lightly. Emily smiled to herself because she knew a 3rd secret. She dumped out the dough into the breadboard. It looked like more like a pile of crumbs than pie crust. Then she rolled. She got flat crumbs instead of pie crust. She rolled a little harder. "Lightly, Emily," Mama said. "Lightly." It was no use. The crumbs would not become crust. Mama came and took the rolling pin from Emily. She scooped the crumbs into a pile, gave them a gentle squeeze and a pat, and rolled them out. Pie crust. "Now let me," pleaded Emily. This part was fun. She draped the crust over the pie tins and slash, trimmed off the ragged edges. Then she tucked under the edges and pressed her thumb around the edge to make neat scallops, just the way Mama did. Preparing the filling was much easier, and soon Emily had her pie shells filled with liquid custard the color of buttercups. Mama tested the oven by holding her hand inside a moment before she set the pies to bake. While Emily and Mama dressed for church, the kitchen was filled with the sweet fragrance of custard. Emily could just see her pies among the others on one of the tables in the church basement, golden yellow and freckled with nutmeg. "Emily, I think it's time to test the pies," said Mama. "Insert a knife, and if it comes out clean, they're done." How good the pies smelled! Emily was filled with anticipation as she found a clean knife. Carefully, she opened the oven door and peeked inside. She could not believe what she saw. Her beautiful buttercup-colored pies! Whatever had happened to them? "Mama!" shrieked Emily. "Come here, quick!" Mama's high heels came tapping down the stairs. "What is it, Emily?" "My pies!" wailed Emily. "Look!" Mama leaned over and looked into the oven. "My land, Emily!" she exclaimed. "The crust is on top." "I put it on the bottom," said Emily. "How did it get on the top?" "I don't know, but I'm sure the pies must be done." Using pot holders, Mama lifted the pies out and set them on the table to cool. They were strange-looking pies. They had nicely browned crust with little patches of custard showing through here and there. "We can't take them to church." Emily was wilted with disappointment. "Now we'll have to miss the potluck dinner, and the minister will forget to announce about the library." Daddy came into the kitchen to examine the pies. "I don't see why we can't take them to church," he said. "There's no reason why a pie can't taste just as good with the crust on the top as on the bottom." "I just don't understand it," said Mama. "It must be something about my oven." "It was my fault," confessed Emily reluctantly, and told her how she had planned to surprise the congregation with light, flaky pie crust by adding a generous pinch of baking powder. She was surprised when both Mama and Daddy thought her story was funny. "That crust is light, all right," said Daddy. "It is so light it floated right up through the custard." Mama examined the pies more closely. You know, the crust really does look light and flaky. All it needed was to be weighed down by a filling of apple or bananas. Now don't worry, raisins. Now don't worry, Emily. We'll wrap up the pies and take them along to church. I'll unwrap them when no one is looking, and there will be so many pies that no one will even notice. I'll eat 2 pieces, said Daddy loyally. And so the Bartletts set off for church, with the 2 pies carefully wrapped in clean dish towels. Emily was wearing her Sunday school hat, which she did not like one bit. Grandma, who could trim such beautiful hats for ladies, had very definite ideas about what was proper for girls Emily's age. Emily longed for a hat trimmed with garlands of flowers and clouds of veiling and maybe an ostrich plume or 2. And what did she get? A stiff black Milan hat with a wide brim, a black ribbon hanging down the back, and an elastic under the chin to keep it on. Mama said Emily had the most beautiful hat of any girl in Pitchfork, but Emily had a different opinion of it. It was such a problem, loving Grandma and not liking her little girl hats. Sunday school was over when the Bartletts arrived at the little white church, and all of the boys and girls were out in the churchyard playing tag to stretch their legs before the service began. Emily's cousin June came running over. "Are you bringing pie?" she asked, and Emily noticed that, as usual, one of her barrettes was slipping. "Yes, June," answered Mama. "Emily did a little baking." "What kind?" demanded June. Mama hesitated for a second. "Custard," she replied. There would probably be a dozen custard pies at the dinner. "We brought coleslaw," said June, and bounded off to try to chin herself on a branch of a locust tree whose leaves were turning yellow. "Why, there's Fong Kwok," observed Mama, while Emily looked quickly off in another direction. Then she felt guilty. Fong Kwok had given a whole $1 to the library. "I hope he's bringing rice," said Daddy. When Fong Kwok was younger and Pitchfork was smaller, he had given a party for the whole town one year. He served Chinese food, and Daddy had never forgotten Fong Kwok's rice. Emily and Mama carried the pies down the steps to the church basement, where some ladies were bustling about setting tables, which were boards laid over sawhorses and measuring coffee into salt sacks to dangle inside the big granite-ware coffee pots. Mama nodded and smiled pleasantly at everyone, and when no one was looking, she slipped the dish towels off the pies and set them on a table with the rest of the desserts. "Mama, I don't see any other custard pies," whispered Emily. "Don't worry, there will be," Mama assured her. Emily was not so sure. Maybe none of the ladies of Pitchfork felt like baking custard pie today. Maybe hers would be the only ones, and June would be sure to blurt that Emily had baked them. June was a great one for blurting things. The church bells began to ring, and Emily thought distinctly, "Ring out ye bells," as she had been taught in school, and filed into the church with Mama and Daddy. Emily felt proud to be sitting in the pew beside Daddy. He looked so big and handsome in his dark suit. Emily always suffered a terrible temptation in church because the brown paint on the backs of the pews was blistered, and she longed to puncture the blisters to see the gray paint underneath. She glanced down the pew, and there was her cousin June, busily puncturing the paint blisters. "Yield not to temptation," Emily told herself sternly, and tried not to squirm or think about her custard pies. Emily forgot about her pies when Mr. Bonnet, the minister, stood up and actually did announce the library from the pulpit. He gave a little talk about the good ladies who were giving so generously of their time to bring books to the people of Pitchfork, and how they would welcome donations of money and good books, and what a fine thing a library would be for the boys and girls growing up in Pitchfork. And the boy who walks down the railroad track with his clean white flour sack, Emily had to add to herself. Then Mr. Bonnet began his text for the day. The miracle of the loaves and the fishes. Emily enjoyed the story of Jesus feeding the multitudes with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. But as Mr. Bonnet went on and on, Emily found it difficult to sit still, and she was sure that the elastic on her hat would choke her before the sermon ended. Mr. Bonnet reminded the congregation that the people of Pitchfork should have faith. It was faith that had fed the multitudes. Emily felt squirmier and squirmier. In Pitchfork, where everything grew so readily, it was easy to have enough faith to feed the multitudes. It was harder to have faith about things like libraries. But if faith would help, Emily would have faith. She squirmed some more and caught Mama frowning at her. To keep herself still, she sat at attention the way she had learned at school. Eyes ahead, back straight, feet on the floor, hands folded, and had faith that Pitchfork would get a real library. The trouble was, the elastic on her hat was so tight. If only Grandma would let her have the kind of grown-up hat that was held on with hat pins instead of this elastic under the chin. What a relief it was to be able to stand up and sing the final hymn. Bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves, we shall come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves. This was Emily's favorite hymn. When she sang it, she could just see Daddy at harvest time, striding along with sheaves of wheat in his arms. As soon as she could, Emily scampered down the steps and around to the door of the church basement. By the time she got there, she had her hat off. She hung it on a hook and sidled over to the table of desserts. If there was one thing the ladies of Pitchfork were good at, it was baking. There were cakes, all kinds of cakes, pound cake, Lady Baltimore cake, angel cake, devil's food. Was it really all right to bring devil's food to church? Emily wondered. Pineapple upside down cake with a cherry in each circle of pineapple. Walnut loaf cake, the kind without frosting. And there were pies, too. Cherry pie with the top crust made of woven strips. Apple pie. Emily could see the cinnamon through the slashes in the crust. Lemon pie with meringue in delicate peaks. Blackberry pies with crimson juice oozing through the crust. And custard pies. 2 of them. Both were Emily's. The only thing Emily could do was pretend that she knew nothing about the pies and hoped that June would forget them. She found a place at a bench beside Daddy at one of the long tables. Mama was busy helping some of the other ladies serve the food. June came along and plopped herself down on the bench beside Emily. "I'm hungry," June announced. "I could eat a horse." Emily felt suddenly shy when Mr. Bonnet sat down opposite her. He was such an important man, a man who could stand up in the pulpit and speak to the multitudes about the library. Whatever could she find to say to him, this man who could speak to the multitudes? The food the ladies set on the table, platters of fried chicken, bowls of chicken and dumplings, string beans that had simmered for hours and bits of bacon, huge pans of escalloped potatoes, bowls of coleslaw, the cabbage sliced thin as paper, and rice. Fong Kwok had brought a huge kettle of rice. His rice was the despair of all the ladies in Pitchfork. All of their husbands asked for rice the way that Fong Kwok cooked it, but no matter how hard they tried, none of the ladies could cook rice so that each grain was separate and fluffy, and there was crisp brown crust on the bottom of the kettle. The ladies of Pitchfork burned a lot of rice trying. Now Emily had another problem to take her mind off of her custard pies and what to say to the minister. That was chicken. At every single Christmas or Thanksgiving dinner, family reunion, church dinner, or lodge supper, someone always served Emily and said, as if offering a great treat, "And here is a drumstick for Emily." Emily did not like drumsticks. She longed for white meat, the piece with the wishbone in it, but always it was drumsticks, drumsticks, drumsticks. Today, however, turned out to be different. A platter of chicken was passed to June, who helped herself to 2 drumsticks before she passed the heavy platter to Emily, who had to rest it on the table. "May I help you?" Emily asked Mr. Bonnet. "No, thank you, I can manage," said Emily hastily, because there were still drumsticks left. She helped herself to the wishbone piece with a feeling of triumph. She would take it home to dry in the warming oven, and when it was brittle, she would use it to make a wish. She would wish for black beauty because that was a little selfish wish. Faith was for big, unselfish things, like a library for the whole town. After that, things were better. Mr. Bonnet did most of the talking, so Emily did not have to worry about what to say to him. He talked about the splendid work of the Ladies' Aid was doing for the church. He talked about the need for more partitions in the Sunday school room. He praised the cooking of the ladies of Pitchfork. When Emily finished her chicken, she wiped the wishbone on her napkin and slipped it into her bloomer leg. Emily found bloomer legs handy for carrying all sorts of things, rubber balls, jacks, even a jumping rope. With Mr. Bonnet talking so much and everyone having to stop eating to listen politely, naturally Emily's table was the last to finish. Emily looked out of the corner of her eye at the table of desserts. There was nothing left but 2 pies, Emily's custard pies. Naturally, they were left to the last. They were such peculiar-looking pies. One of the ladies was cutting them now. How perfectly dreadful! Emily wanted to crawl under the table. She was so embarrassed. Of course, one of the ladies served the minister first. "I'm not quite sure what kind of pie this is," she said apologetically. "It looks like custard, but the crust is on top." "Is that the pie you baked?" June asked Emily. Emily nodded. "Well, well," said Mr. Bonnet in a voice that reached the multitudes in the church basement. "So this little lady baked the pie." Emily squirmed on the hard bench. Everyone turned to look at the little lady who baked the pies. The minister looked around at the people at his table. Then he looked at the pies. "Wait a minute," he said. "There are 12 pieces of pie and 20 people at the table. There isn't enough to go around." He picked up a knife and cut each piece of pie into 2 pieces. "There now, that is more like it," he said. "Enough to go around and second helpings for some. Like the loaves and the fishes, eh, Emily?" He laughed heartily at his own joke. Feeding the multitudes her custard pie was the last thing that Emily wanted to do. Since she had baked it, she felt duty-bound to take a piece too, even though she did not care much for anything as slippery feeling as custard pie. What would people think if she was not willing to eat her own pie? "It's awfully funny custard pie," remarked June. Then Emily had an inspiration. "It is called upside-down pie," she said. "Upside-down cake, why not upside-down pie? Let people think the crust was supposed to be on the top." The minister ate a mouthful of pie. "Delicious," he pronounced it. "The crust is light and flaky." Everyone at the table murmured in agreement. Emily's pie was light and flaky. They said exactly what Emily had planned that they should say before her crust had risen through the custard. "You know," remarked one of the ladies thoughtfully, "having the crust on top is an excellent idea for custard pie. So often the crust is on the bottom and becomes soggy. Tell me, Emily, what is the secret of such a light, flaky crust?" Emily smiled modestly. "I added a generous pinch of baking powder," she said. And that is the end of chapter 7. And Emily's pie was praised after all, and she felt like a successful cook. For the potluck supper, there are all the pie ingredients waiting out there, and there's the baking powder right there waiting for the generous pinch. And let's find the other picture here with Emily and her mother peeking into the oven going, "What on earth has happened to the pies? They did not look like they were supposed to look." And let's see if there are any more pictures. I think that might be it. That is the end of chapter 7, and this is Grandma Carla, and I love you.